Okay, I think we're live. Just wait for people to trickle in, and I mean that quite literally. I'm not expecting a flood of viewers, especially since this wasn't announced. Uh, for the people that do come in, if you could tell me, am I being heard? I just want to figure out if these headphones work or not. They, if I can be heard by the people out there, the interwebs. I'll find out eventually anyway. So, yeah, I haven't done a stream in quite a bit. I think the last one, if I'm not mistaken, I think the last time I live streamed it was from my phone, and it was the 4th of July, an Independence Day celebration at St. George, a very crowded boardwalk right above the Staten Island ferry, or the St. George ferry, as people in Staten Island call it, obviously, because we're here. We're not. People in Manhattan would call it the Staten Island ferry. But I think that was the last time I streamed, and that was actually pretty interesting stream. Doing it in front of hundreds of, or in a crowd of hundreds of people, and a lot of loud uh, firework fireworks preparation. Lots of loud background activity and ambient noise. Uh, but I think that was the last time. Someone in the chat can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just gonna wait for Danny Polishek to stream snipe my zero viewer. My zero. This would probably be one of the least interesting streams, zero viewer streams that he sniped. Um, although that crossing streams is pretty interesting. The basic premise is he searches for streams that have zero or sometimes only a handful of viewers and just listens in. Although yesterday he actually had a conversation with an awkward conversation with one of the streamers. Anyway, I was going to talk a little bit about the migrant. I don't want to use the word crisis. It seems overused, but also very inadequate to describe what's happening right now. Essentially, thousands of foreigners coming in from Mexico, although they're using Arizona and Texas and Florida as sort of a launching pad from within the United States, and being sent to New York City primarily. Although I think they're also being shipped to Chicago and Los Angeles, big, densely populated blue cities that have had terrible immigration policies for decades in most cases. The the particular, what they call a sanctuary city policy, this actually stems from an executive order issued by the late Mayor Ed Koch. I think I'm not sure if it was 1988 or 87, but sometime during Ed Koch's third term in office, he issued a directive mandating that no, essentially what he did was force every city agency to turn a blind eye to illegal aliens, regardless of the circumstances or what sort of threat they posed or their history. Essentially, every person who was in the city without papers, um, they couldn't report them to what was then the INS and is now called ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. So they couldn't have any. They had essentially like a non-cooperation agreement with federal immigration authorities, and this was something that just began to get more and more restrictive as time went on. And it was actually challenged by a group, the Center, I think it was the Center for Immigration Studies. There are only a few national immigration reform groups that don't want to loosen immigration restrictions, and CIS is one of them. But I think it was challenged by CIS or Numbers USA, one of these groups, and it was struck down by a federal judge. But for some reason, the the intent behind the policy remains in place, and there's no. And this was one of. I remember this was a huge story years ago. There was a famous director and screenwriter named Adrienne Shelley. She was an auteur and an acclaimed independent filmmaker. I don't know how many of you have heard of it, but she was famous. One of the last films she was involved in was called Waitress, um, and this went on to become an incredibly popular Broadway play. But she was behind that, and she was killed. She's married to a, or she was married to Andrew Ostroy, who's a very who's a political activist, um, in the Democratic Party and in liberal circles. But she was killed by this guy named Diego Pilco, who was here from Ecuador, here illegally. He was working. He was essentially doing labor on in the apartment below hers, and she complained about it. She was very because it distracted her. She couldn't do her work. And in response to this, he went in and killed her, murdered her, and staged the scene to make it look like she had committed suicide. And later on, the police came, and initially they thought just that she had killed herself until her husband Andrew Ostroy and his family exerted pressure on the police department. Um, a lot of times, the cops they want to do the least amount of work possible, so that leads to bad conclusions. So in this case, because they were pressed, hey Richard, shalom. Can you hear me? I know I say this after I've been streaming for nearly 9 minutes, but I just want to make sure. Just give me a thumbs up or okay, that's good. So the headphones are working. Anyway, just to to put a button on the story, his pressure, the pressure he exerted, forced them to actually do an investigation, and they concluded that Diego Pilco. It was very obvious that he murdered Adrienne Shelley, and for very briefly there was an outpouring of disgust and outrage that someone that essentially the reason he was able to murder her was because he wasn't deported. That's the long and short of it. And there are more there are more cases like that. This is just the most extreme example, but the idea the underlying principle to just not enforce this law because it inconveniences um, people who are here illegally is preposterous. And this is sort of the end. The end result is New York City becoming a destination um, for migrants. Although the proximate cause is obviously loosening of the border. I mean, there were up until the present administration, there was obviously 500,000 people cross illegally from Mexico. There's obviously you have a porous border. It's impossible, even if you wanted to. It's extremely difficult to police every single inch. You would have to every inch of the border between Mexico and the United States. You would have to build something approaching the Great Wall of China, and that's not feasible. Nonetheless, the the situation was there was some stability there. There wasn't a welcome mat on the border. So even though there's obviously illegal immigration, an annual amount of illegal immigration that comes from the border, it was within reasonable limits. It could be addressed, but now it's essentially a de facto open border, and it's become worse with the amount of edicts and executive orders essentially regularizing something that's not. The whole idea is if you are a genuine refugee or political asylee fleeing, for example, Nicolas Maduro, you're a political opponent of Nicolas Maduro, or the president of El Salvador, or whomever, whichever country you're fleeing. If you're a dissident, the idea is you apply for asylum in the nearest country. Just like or the nearest uh, free country. For example, if you were fleeing North Korea, the DPRK, you would apply for asylum. You would try to settle in Mongolia or Thailand. If you were smuggled through Laos, you would try to find the nearest open country and apply for asylum. And what's going on now is essentially they're using Mexico as a conduit. Mexico and several other countries. So it's not even like they're going directly from their country to Mexico and then to the United States. They're using several other countries and then trying to remain in the United States, which is not it's not how it's supposed to work. And it's kind of interesting, like the reaction of the local officials in New York City is illustrative of nothing more than their own incompetence. I mean, uh, a lot of people had uh, they had the philosophy that no one could be worse than Bill De Blasio because he was such a dilettante and so inept at his job. And during his last term, he was focused mostly on funneling money into his wife's slush fund, or his estranged wife. I don't think they're together now, Shirlene McRae, but like he was concerned with that and launching a quixotic bid for the presidency than actually governing the city. And a lot of people thought that no one could be worse than him until Mayor Adams, Eric Adams, became mayor. And just like De Blasio, he's never had a real job. I mean, even he kind of he portrays himself as a cop or an ex-cop, but even when he was a police officer, he was essentially, I don't know how to describe it, but he was, if if you think of like the media relations department or the PR department for the army, or like that's, hey Uggy, uh if you think of like, how the army has a PR department, or pays people to promote or recruit, like that was essentially what Adams did when he was a cop. He held a lot of press conferences. Oh, hey Jerry. He held a lot of press conferences. He would go on marches. But he didn't really. I don't want to diminish anyone for their occupation, but it's not like he was bringing down syndicated crime, like, or like a syndicated cartel. He was, busting up. He was essentially, being a cop was a prelude to being a state senator and then a borough president, which is um, a vestigial office that pays in the six figures, but essentially does nothing. It was created when the Board of Estimate was eliminated in New York City, and then eventually becoming mayor. So essentially, like De Blasio, he's been a political creature his whole life. And I think what's worse is that, unlike De Blasio, could at least hold a press conference and could fool some of the people into believing that he was somewhat competent, but that's that illusion has been completely stripped away with Eric Adams. I remember someone was telling me about yeah, I heard this. Someone was shocked. Someone someone was shocked when they actually heard Eric. They don't live in New York City, but they were shocked when they heard Eric Adams speaking, and they had no idea who. I guess they assumed he was less uh bumbling. I don't even know how to, for people who don't live in New York City. You may have seen little sound bites of Eric Adams, just because New York City is in the middle of this uh, deluge, and we're dealing with the tail end of the open border. But you may have heard sound bites, but like, you have to have been here for a while and just followed Eric Adams to appreciate how dumb he is. Uh, um, this is the only place I stream at. I only do YouTube streams. I used to co-host a podcast with my friend Todd Seavey called CV and Perry on Culture. And believe it or not, you can actually find old episodes. It was a film. It was essentially a film. It was kind of like Siskel and Ebert if no one watched, and they weren't, and they weren't actual film critics, but um, it was basically, we would review films and talk about it. So you can actually find old episodes of CV and Perry if you do a search in the you go to the search bar and type in CV and Perry on culture. You can find old episodes. Uh, we also did some episodes on Podbeam, which no longer exists, probably fortunately. But yeah, you would think, like, the feds. The problem is the feds don't want to tighten anything. And I was talking with someone about this today. The just Ukrainians. This is a great example. I think 400,000 or thereabouts Ukrainians have been given temporary. I'm not sure if it's temporary protected status, or they simply created another program via executive fiat. Like, I I don't know if they just create another program where they or added it as an addendum to a military spending bill. But I think 400,000 Ukrainians have also been given uh, temporary legal status because of the Russia-Ukraine war. So it's not like we're addressing the problem; adding to we're adding to the problem. Um, it'll be interesting to see what happens if when the rent control laws go to the Supreme Court, because there's no I mean, they're the the places they're planning on putting these migrants, they just get more and more outlandish. For a while, they wanted to warehouse them on at Floyd Bennett Field. Then they wanted to house them in the gymnasiums of schools. Now in Staten Island, there are protests because they're sending migrants to shelters there, and it just it makes you wonder is the what's the end game here? What's the end game gonna be? Are they going to ship them upstate? Kathy Hochul doesn't seem to be a fan of that. Uh, so it makes you wonder. But anyway, I didn't want to stay on too long. Those are just my disjointed thoughts on the subject. But thanks everyone who came. Jerry, Richard, Uggy, whomever else is listening. I see there are a couple of viewers. The next governor's race is, I want to say, 2026. I'm pretty sure it's 2026. Let me just check. Because I think I'm pretty sure Hochul was just reelected. Let me see. Yeah. Okay. So the last election was last year, so it will be in a little less than 3 years. And one of the reasons Hochul won is because so many potential voters for her opponent left during the lockdown. New York made it as inhospitable as possible for sane and rational people to stay here. So a huge chunk of them left for Florida, and that was the difference. So we'll see what happens. I don't see things improving, but I am in terms of politics. I'm a pessimist. I think we do have hope. Because we have hope in Christ. Obviously, I think things are going to work out in the end for those who are in Christ. But as far as the political landscape, especially in New York, I don't see things improving.